Hello, everybody. Here we are back again for the second part of chapter 4. I thought she was asleep on my lap, but nope, she's awake. So, the name of this chapter was The Mount of Injury. And we talked the first part of the chapter, Craven Fear came and tried to get Much Afraid to go home with him. And she called the shepherd and he came. And now they're starting up the steep part of the mountain. And she's tied together with her companions, Sorrow and Suffering. Do you remember? Okay, so we're starting right off with this picture. Here she is, climbing up the mountain. Once on the track, Much Afraid discovered to her surprise that it wasn't nearly as hard as it had looked. It was very steep and slippery, but because she was tightly roped between Sorrow and Suffering and had the tiny bottle of the Spirit of Grace and Comfort, Much Afraid felt quite safe. She didn't look down unless she had to, and once, when she did dare to look, she was very thankful that the shepherd had told them to start climbing right away. Sitting on the rocks were all 5 of her enemies, looking up angrily. She remembered the shepherd's warning that she would probably meet them at the top. She wondered how they would get there and realized there must be some other way they could use. The 3 steadily climbed higher and higher. They arrived at the cave just as darkness fell. Right beside the entrance was a tiny waterfall. They were thankful for a refreshing drink from its waters. Inside the cave were piles of sheepskins they could use to rest on. Aren't you grateful that you have a bed and you don't have to go to sleep on a sheepskin? And Sorrow and Suffering pulled out packages of dried fruit and nuts the shepherd had given them. They ate gratefully and then fell into a deep and peaceful sleep. Much Afraid woke early the next morning and walked to the entrance of the cave. She looked out to try to get a view of things from her high window. As far as the eye could see was the desert and lonely sea. The fruit orchards that they had passed through were out of sight, and everywhere she looked it was cold, empty, and sad. Even the rocky wall they were on looked even harder and more awful than she remembered. Just then she looked up at the cliff beside the tiny waterfall, and to her delighted surprise, she saw a beautiful plant. It was growing in a tiny crevice of rock. Do you see? And on its stem grew a single flower. Much Afraid stared at the brilliant red petals. "What is your name, little flower? I have never seen another one like you before." "My name is Bearing with Love," the little plant seemed to whisper, "but some call me Forgiveness." Much Afraid realized at once that this was the new lesson the shepherd wanted her to learn. "Why is that your name?" she asked. A little whispering laugh seemed to pass through its leaves. "I was taken away from my family and friends and put in the prison of this rock. The ones who did this left me alone, not caring what happened to me. But I didn't stop loving, and love helped me push through the crack. Now look at me. What flower is more blessed and satisfied than I?" Much Afraid looked at the flower's tiny glowing petals and wanted to be like it. She knelt beneath the imprisoned flower and whispered, "Here I am. My name will be Bearing with Love too. No matter how I am hurt or mistreated, I will choose to forgive." At that moment, a piece of rock which imprisoned the roots of the flower loosened and fell at her feet. She picked it up and gently added it with the others to her bag. Sorrow and Suffering were waiting in the cave with a breakfast of bread, raisins, and nuts. Then the 3 roped themselves together again and once more began to climb Mount Injury. After a little time, they came to a place that was very steep. Suddenly, Much Afraid slipped and cut herself quite badly on the sharp rocks. So you can see they're holding her up, but she got hurt and she's crying. It was a good thing that she was held so tightly by the rope, because her heart filled with fear and she felt like she would faint. She crouched closely to the wall and wept for fear. Immediately, Suffering came up from behind her, held Much Afraid in her arms, and whispered, "Drink a bit from the Spirit of grace and comfort." Much Afraid trembled. "I don't even know where it is." Suffering reached into Much Afraid's pocket and took out the small bottle. She poured a few drops between Much Afraid's lips, and the faintness began to go away, but she still couldn't move. She drank a bit more and then felt strengthened. They started the climb again, but it went very slowly. In her fall, Much Afraid had cut both knees so badly that she could only limp forward, moaning with pain. Her helpers were very patient, but finally Suffering asked, "What were you doing this morning at the front of the cave?" Much Afraid was startled by the question. "I was looking at a flower I had never seen before, growing in a rock by the waterfall." "What kind of flower was it?" Suffering asked. "It was the flower of bearing with love," Much Afraid answered softly, "but some call it forgiveness." For a few moments she was quiet, remembering the stone she had put in her bag and the lesson she had learned from the beautiful plant. So here she is starting to climb again, and there are her helpers. Then she said, "I wonder if it would help if we put a few drops from the bottle on my scraped knees." "That is a very good idea," said Sorrow and Suffering together. "Let's try." As they dropped a little of the Spirit of grace and comfort on her knees, the bleeding stopped and the worst of the pain disappeared. Her legs were still quite stiff, and she still limped, but the three were able to move faster. By late afternoon, they reached the top of the rocky wall and came to a forest of young pine trees with moss and blueberries growing beside the path. They sat down on a mossy bank to rest and heard a voice coming toward them singing. Who do you think it was? It was the shepherd. He sat beside them and cheerfully praised them for reaching the top of Mount Injury. He gently laid his hands on Much Afraid's wounds, and immediately they disappeared. Then he began to speak to them about where this new path would lead. "You will now go through the forests of danger and tribulation." Tribulation means a really big trouble. "The path may get quite dark, and there will be storms along the way. Stay close to each other. Remember that as long as you stay on my path, nothing can really hurt you." "The forest of danger and tribulation," Much Afraid cried. "Oh, shepherd, where will you lead me next?" Poor thing is just not really having a good day, is she? Or a good series of days. "To the next place on your journey to the high places," he answered with a smile, "to places which will help you develop Hinds' feet. Trust me, Much Afraid." She looked down at her feet. They seemed more crooked than ever. Then Much Afraid lifted her head and looked into the eyes of her shepherd. "I will trust you to do as you have promised," she said softly. "Whatever path you lead me on, I will not fear, because you are with me." She knelt and built another altar and added yet another stone to her bag, and then Much Afraid started on the path which led, you comfortable? Which led to the forests of danger and tribulation. Did you see the deer over here? Isn't that cool? And there's her with the shepherd. So that actually is the end of chapter 4. So in this one, they talked about forgiveness. Now, forgiveness is kind of a big deal, and sometimes it's really hard to do, but it also is really important and one of the things that Jesus asks us to do. In fact, when Jesus was here on earth and one of his disciples got really annoyed that he had to keep forgiving someone, he said, "How many times do I have to do this?" And Jesus actually said 70 times 7, which is a whole lot of times. So that's the end of chapter 4, and I will see you tomorrow with the beginning of chapter 5. Good night.